Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
I was halfway through slicing a piece of dry, overpriced chicken breast when my sister leaned across her marble kitchen island, lifted her wine glass just high enough to catch everyone's attention, and said with the sweetest possible smile, "This dinner is for achievers only." The words didn't land immediately, not for everyone. Some of the guests gave that kind of laugh people do when they're not sure if they've just heard a joke or a knife in disguise. But I heard it clearly. I knew exactly who it was aimed at. I looked around that perfectly curated dining room, reclaimed wood table imported from Tuscany, walls covered in framed vacation photos, where everyone's teeth were professionally whitened, napkins folded like origami swans. And it hit me all at once that I was not just unwanted here, I was being made an example of. I didn't say anything. I didn't react. That's the part that probably bothered her the most, in the end. Caroline always liked to see me squirm, ever since we were kids, when she'd brag about her grades while I quietly hid another detention slip in my backpack. But this time, I just put my fork down, smiled back at her like I hadn't just been publicly humiliated in front of her in-laws, her country club friends, and her carefully filtered circle of acquaintances, and excused myself to the bathroom. I grabbed my purse on the way, though. She didn't notice. The dinner had been framed as a celebration for her daughter, Maddie, my niece, who had just gotten a scholarship to a fancy private prep school 2 towns over. I was proud of her. I really was. That kid is smarter than all of us combined, with enough sarcasm to make her borderline dangerous by 15. I bought her a bracelet from a local artisan. Nothing fancy, but something thoughtful, something I could afford on my budget. I handed it to her at the start of dinner, and I swear she lit up for a moment before her mother snatched it from her hands and set it aside like it was a leftover from a gas station vending machine. Caroline had been looking for a reason to put me in my place ever since she found out I was unemployed again. I've had a rough few years, left a toxic job, struggled to find a new one, lost my apartment, lived with a friend for 6 months, scraped by with temp work and gig jobs while trying to rebuild some sense of purpose. I'm not proud of it, but I've never once asked her for money. Not once. She loves to forget that part. So when she clinked her glass and dropped that line, "Achievers only," it wasn't just a jab. It was a power move. And in that moment, I realized something that made me colder than I've ever felt. Caroline wasn't just trying to insult me. She was trying to erase me. I didn't go to the bathroom. I walked straight out the front door, got in my car, and sat in the dark for a moment, letting my heart settle. Then I did something I hadn't done in almost 10 years. I called David Walker, the lawyer who had handled the trust fund for Maddie and her younger brother Jake, after their father, Caroline's late husband Matthew, passed away. David picked up after 3 rings, probably surprised to hear my voice. I told him I needed to revisit the paperwork. He hesitated at first until I reminded him of the clause, the one no one ever talked about, the one that made me co-trustee, along with Caroline, over the fund that was set up for the kids. A technicality, really, but one their father had insisted on during those last few weeks in the hospital. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I figured it was symbolic, maybe even sentimental. He and I had gotten along. I was the only one in the family who had visited him regularly when he was sick. The only one who actually sat and listened to his paranoia about Caroline's spending, her need for appearances, her obsession with social standing. I had chalked it up to grief back then, but now it felt like foresight. David agreed to meet the following week. I hung up, sat in silence, and watched the porch lights of Caroline's mansion flicker in the distance. I could still hear the laughter through the windows, high-pitched and polite, the sound of people congratulating themselves on lives they believed they'd earned, even if they were inherited or married into. It was strange. I didn't feel angry. I felt resolute. That's the only word I can use. For the first time in years, I felt like I was holding something that mattered, something solid. Caroline had spent decades stepping on people like me, dressing it up in charity and cheerful cruelty. She believed her money made her untouchable. She believed the rules didn't apply to her. But the truth was, I had something she'd forgotten I possessed: control. When I drove away, I didn't even look in the rearview mirror. I just rolled down the window, let the cool evening air hit my face, and allowed myself the first real smile I'd had in months. Because Caroline had made one fatal mistake that night. She thought I was still the same person who used to let her get away with everything. She thought I'd just quietly leave. She had no idea I was going to take everything from her, piece by piece, using nothing but her own husband's signature. And the best part? She wouldn't even see it coming. It's strange the way a memory can claw its way out of the dust in your mind once someone flips the right emotional switch. Like muscle memory, but crueler, because it doesn't hit your hands or your legs. It hits the back of your throat and your stomach, and that place behind your ribs where old decisions never really die. They just lie in wait. That's how it felt when I sat in David Walker's office again, nearly a decade after the funeral. The funeral where Caroline barely shed a tear and wore black like it was just another item off her Neiman Marcus registry. David hadn't changed much, maybe a little more gray around the edges, a little slower to move, but sharp as ever. He offered me coffee, which I declined, mostly because I didn't trust my hands not to shake, not out of fear, but anticipation. I knew what I was doing wasn't illegal, far from it, but I also knew I was opening a door that had been closed for so long, nobody even remembered it existed. David pulled the files from storage, literal paper, in a heavy beige folder with my name in the corner, and Caroline's, and of course Matthew's. The handwriting in the margins was unmistakably his, bold, slanted, fast. It made me feel a strange kind of sick. Not sadness exactly, more like a guilt that was trying to form but couldn't fully materialize. Because even though I had loved him as a brother-in-law and had mourned him as a friend, I couldn't ignore the truth. The moment he died, Caroline turned that loss into a career move. She cried into silk handkerchiefs and gave public speeches about grief while she negotiated real estate deals over the phone and joined 3 charity boards within a month. And when the trust was finalized, and I was named as co-trustee, a detail she barely acknowledged, she smiled that tight-lipped smile of hers and said, "Of course, makes perfect sense." But it hadn't made perfect sense to her, not then, not now, and I think even Matthew knew that one day this clause would matter. He had been generous in death, but also strategic. The trust was structured in such a way that funds were only to be used strictly for the benefit of Maddie and Jake, with oversight from both trustees, and most importantly, with explicit approval required for any expenditure above a certain threshold. That threshold, I discovered with a slow exhale, was far below what Caroline had been spending. On things like travel, luxury tutoring, and, according to one flag document, a week-long wellness retreat in Sedona that she had tried to categorize as emotional development for Maddie. It wasn't until I saw the spreadsheet, itemized, color-coded, and almost arrogantly transparent, that I realized just how deep the rot went. Caroline had been using the trust not as a safety net for her children's future, but as a revolving door of self-gratification, a back pocket fund to support the lifestyle she wanted people to believe she had earned. And the most insulting part? She wasn't even being discreet about it. She didn't think anyone would ever question her. She thought that because I'd stayed quiet for years, I would always stay quiet. I told David I wanted a full audit. I told him I wanted documentation of every withdrawal and the justification that accompanied it. I told him I wanted a legal notification sent to Caroline, informing her that I was exercising my co-trustee rights and initiating a formal pause on all future disbursements until further review. David hesitated, not out of reluctance, but concern, the kind of pause that comes when someone wants to ask, "Are you sure you want to do this?" without actually saying it. I nodded once, firm. I wasn't doing this out of revenge, not entirely. I was doing it because somewhere along the way, Caroline had forgotten that these weren't just numbers in an account. They were meant to be protection. They were meant to be a promise. He agreed, and I signed the papers with a strange calm I didn't expect. It was only after I left his office, walked out into the parking lot where the sun was sinking low and the asphalt still radiated heat, that the full weight of what I had just done hit me. Not as fear, but as clarity. I wasn't trying to destroy her. I wasn't even trying to expose her. I was trying to correct the course. The one she had gleefully derailed for years, while everyone else smiled and nodded and whispered behind closed doors. The call came 2 days later. It was late afternoon, and I was folding laundry while watching a rerun of some cooking competition I couldn't follow, when my phone lit up with her name, Caroline. I let it ring through, and then again, and a third time. On the fourth try, I answered, just to hear what flavor of indignation she'd use. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice already raised, sharp and shaky like a woman who had never been told no in her adult life and suddenly couldn't breathe from the shock of it. I didn't give her the satisfaction of surprise. "You'll need to talk to David," I said calmly, folding a towel. "I'm not discussing legal matters over the phone." "You don't get to do this," she snapped. And it was then, in that exact moment, that I heard the truth inside her tone. It wasn't confidence, it was panic. She knew exactly what I could do, what I was doing, and she had no defense prepared because she never believed she'd need one. But all I said was, "Actually, I do, and I just did." Then I hung up. It was quiet after that. She didn't call again that night or the next. But I knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot, because Caroline wasn't the type to go down with grace or silence. No, she was the type to scratch, claw, and scream. And when she finally showed up at my door, I knew it would be loud, ugly, and long overdue. But I also knew one more thing. She had just lost control of the one thing she cared about more than money, more than image, more than even her kids, the narrative. And now it was mine to tell. It was 3 days after that final phone call, the one I ended without raising my voice, without giving her a single emotional hook to pull on, without letting her know just how much satisfaction I felt in the quiet that followed when she finally did what I'd been waiting for. She showed up on my doorstep like a storm in heels, pounding on the door with such force that I almost thought it might splinter under her rings. I had half a mind to leave her standing out there, to let her scream and claw and spin her drama to the neighbors until someone finally told her she was embarrassing herself. But I suppose some part of me, maybe the tired, brittle part that still remembered what it was like to share a bedroom with her as kids, couldn't help but open the door. Not out of sympathy, just curiosity. I wanted to see what she looked like without the mask. She didn't bother with greetings or pleasantries, or even a glance around my modest front porch, where a dying succulent sat in a chipped ceramic pot, and the paint on the railing had started to peel. She pushed past me the second the door opened, dragging a designer handbag that looked absurd in my living room, a room that hadn't been redecorated since I moved in, with mismatched furniture and a coffee table I'd bought secondhand off Craigslist. It didn't bother me, though. Not anymore. If anything, it added contrast. She spun around, eyes wide, jaw clenched so tight I could practically hear her molars grinding. Her blouse, pale silk with one button slightly off-center, was soaked through under the arms, and her makeup, normally flawless and smug, was cracked just slightly around the corners, enough that I could see the real skin underneath. She looked like a woman unraveling. "You have no right," she hissed, her voice shaking with a fury that wasn't theatrical anymore. It was real, raw. "You don't get to meddle in my finances, in my life, in how I raise my children. You don't get to—" "I have every legal right," I interrupted. Not loud, not aggressive, just plain and direct, like I was reading the ingredients off a cereal box. "Matthew made sure of that. You signed off on it. You just never thought you'd have to deal with the consequences." Her mouth opened, then closed again, like she was about to scream, and realized she didn't even have the words ready. She paced the room, her heels tapping an angry rhythm against my old hardwood floor, muttering half-finished thoughts and outrage that couldn't seem to crystallize into a coherent argument. I let her go on, watched her burn herself down to embers, because I knew what was coming. I'd seen this before, growing up. Caroline only got this frantic when she'd lost control, not just of a situation, but of perception. When she finally stopped, she stared at me like I'd morphed into someone she didn't recognize. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. And for the first time, I heard something underneath the venom. Not guilt, not even remorse, but disbelief. It hadn't occurred to her that anyone in her orbit, least of all me, would stand up to her and not immediately fold when faced with her anger. "We're family," she said, as if the word still held power, as if it still meant obligation instead of manipulation. "I'm doing this," I said slowly so she'd hear every word and know I meant them. "Because your children deserve better than being used as a cover story for your lifestyle. Because Maddie and Jake's trust isn't your emergency fund. Because Matthew trusted me to step in if this ever happened, and it did. And because I let you get away with so much for so long that you forgot someone was still watching." She scoffed, then laughed. Not a real laugh, more of a jagged sound wrapped in disbelief, and dropped her bag on the couch like she might be staying. "You think you're saving them? You don't know anything about raising kids. You don't have any. You don't know what it costs to keep up with the people they go to school with, what it takes to get them ahead." "That's exactly the problem," I said, my voice sharper now, finally pulling the edge out. "You're raising them like a brand, not a family. You don't care who they are. You only care how they make you look." She flinched then. Not much, but enough. She reached into her bag, pulled out a folder, and threw it on my coffee table. I didn't flinch, didn't touch it. I knew what it was before I even saw it. Financial records, proof, excuses, probably printed emails begging for mercy, each one trying to frame me as the villain who had turned her world upside down. "I'll take this to court," she said. "I'll have you removed." "You're welcome to try," I replied, already knowing she wouldn't. Or if she did, it would be a disaster, because the moment the audit started, the moment an outside eye looked at those accounts, the lies would pile up too fast for even her to spin. I'd done the math. The tuition withdrawals that didn't match school invoices, the personal expenses disguised as therapy bills, the vacations filed under developmental enrichment. It was all there, waiting. She stood silent, her face shifting between rage and calculation, trying to find a move, a route, an angle that might still save her from herself. But there wasn't one. She turned to leave, hesitated at the door, then turned back with a venom-laced smile. The same one I remembered from when we were teenagers, and she told our mother I had stolen $20 from her purse, knowing full well she'd taken it herself. "You always thought you were better than me," she said, low and bitter. "No," I replied. "I just stopped trying to be like you." She left without another word, heels clacking down the steps like gunshots, her perfume lingering in the air long after the door slammed shut. I waited a moment, then picked up the folder, glanced through it, and dropped it back onto the table. She didn't understand something crucial, something she probably never would. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the way she twisted love into leverage, the way she dressed up control as concern, the way she buried her shame so deep she genuinely believed she was a good mother just because the house was clean and the fridge was full of overpriced fruit. This wasn't about revenge, not in the way she feared. This was about making sure her kids never had to learn love through performance, never had to prove their worth by the car they drove, or the friends they kept, or the false smiles they plastered on for Instagram. And if she thought this was over, if she thought one storming visit and a few idle threats would scare me back into silence, then she had no idea who I'd become. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my sister. I was the one with the fire now, and I had only just started to light the match. The silence after Caroline's outburst was louder than any screaming match we could have had. And in the days that followed, something subtle but deliberate began to shift. Not just between the two of us, but in the spaces around her. In the tightly wound social circles she'd spent so many years building and curating and managing with the precision of a military campaign. As though her reputation were a stock she had to keep artificially inflated through constant strategic spin. I didn't have to do much, really. All it took was a few well-placed conversations, casual and brief, with people who already suspected something wasn't quite right. Women in her PTA group who had started whispering about inconsistencies in her donation receipts. An old friend of hers who once confided in me during a wine-soaked brunch that she felt used by Caroline's constant need for social favors. And even her mother-in-law, who never really liked her but tolerated her for Matthew's sake, and still called me on my birthday every year, despite everything that had happened since the funeral. It wasn't lies I told. That would have made me no better than her, and frankly, I didn't need to lie. The truth was sharper, more effective, and far more believable coming from someone like me, someone who wasn't rich, who didn't wear designer clothes, who never pretended to be more than she was. I made offhand comments, gentle, almost apologetic, about how difficult things must be for Caroline lately, how the trust fund had needed reviewing because of a few discrepancies, how I hoped everything would sort itself out, but wasn't sure how the private school board would feel about a pending audit, especially one that might involve misuse of funds earmarked for tuition. I never accused. I never pointed fingers. I just let the implication hang in the air, like a lingering scent no one could place, but everyone noticed. And it worked. Not overnight, of course. Not in some dramatic, cinematic unraveling. But slowly, piece by piece, the sheen around her started to tarnish. The invites to key fundraisers dried up, or came late, or were politely rescinded with vague language about streamlining the guest list. A woman she considered a close ally stopped tagging her in social media posts and began appearing more frequently in photos with other mothers, the ones who had always seemed a little intimidated by Caroline but now laughed more freely without her hovering nearby. Her real estate broker, a man she once bragged had helped her flip a property for a six-figure profit, suddenly started dodging her calls. And the final nail, though she didn't know it at the time, came when Maddie herself, confused and frustrated by a missing deposit for her school trip, called me directly for answers. That conversation shook me more than I'd expected, not because she was angry or even because she was hurt, but because of how calmly she asked the questions. Maddie had always been perceptive, sharper than her mother realized, and when she sat across from me in the local cafe, not the kind Caroline would be caught dead in, but the one with the chipped mugs and strong coffee where I spent most of my mornings freelancing, she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Is it true that the trust money was being used for stuff that wasn't about me or Jake?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because for a second I saw a flicker of something in her expression that reminded me of Matthew. The same quiet determination, the same steady, careful thinking. I told her yes, I told her I couldn't go into every detail yet, but that her father had set it up so someone would protect what he'd left for her, even if that person had to make uncomfortable decisions. To my surprise, she didn't get upset. She didn't defend her mother or storm off or accuse me of making things worse. She just nodded, slow and thoughtful, and said, "I think I already knew. I just didn't want to say it out loud." That was the moment I realized the real damage Caroline had done wasn't financial. It wasn't about luxury hotels or designer handbags purchased with money meant for her children's education. It was about trust, the kind that kids don't even know they've placed in their parents until it's broken. Maddie hadn't just lost a trip or a school deposit. She'd lost something far more fragile. The belief that her mother was looking out for her. Not just for herself. I gave her a copy of the trust agreement. The original, not the sanitized version her mother had likely paraphrased over the years, and told her to read it, ask questions, and think about what she wanted to do next. I didn't push. I didn't try to manipulate her. I just gave her the facts and let her sit with them, because I knew that once she saw it in black and white, she'd start putting together the rest of the puzzle on her own. It wasn't long after that when Jake, younger and more reserved, started asking questions too. His were simpler. Why had his allowance stopped? Why did his mom get so mad when he brought up Uncle Matthew's name? Why did Grandma say weird things about the house being over-leveraged? I answered what I could, honestly but gently, and told him that none of it was his fault, that none of this was because of anything he had done or failed to do. Word began to spread, not like gossip, though Caroline would later accuse me of exactly that, but like wildfire contained in whispers. The kind of rumors that start from the truth and evolve into questions people are too afraid to ask aloud. She began to feel it, the shift in tone at social functions, the subtle pulling away of people who used to orbit her like moons around a planet they thought was made of gold. Her Instagram posts, carefully staged family moments with just the right filter, started getting fewer likes, more vague comments. She tried to double down, posting photos of luxury dinners and charity galas with captions that sounded almost frantic in their cheerfulness. But the effect was off. People noticed. People always notice. And then she vanished. For 3 days. No one knew where she went. Maddie thought she was on another trip, maybe a spa retreat to decompress. Jake said she left in a rush, barely packed, didn't say goodbye. The housekeeper claimed she was on business, though she didn't say whose. When she returned, late in the evening with her hair unbrushed and her phone off, she did something I wasn't prepared for. She came to my house again, but this time she didn't scream. She didn't barge in. She didn't threaten lawsuits or call me names. She handed me a letter. It was in Matthew's handwriting, dated just before his death, and addressed to me. She said nothing as she passed it over, her eyes hollow and unreadable. She didn't wait for me to open it. She didn't stay for tea. She simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of her car like a woman who had finally run out of tricks. I stood there for a long time before I opened it. And when I did, the words I saw changed everything I thought I knew. Not just about Caroline, but about Matthew, about his intentions, and about the quiet legacy he had entrusted me with. Because it turned out this wasn't just about protecting Maddie and Jake. It had always been about protecting them from her, and he'd known it all along. There are certain moments in life that arrive not with the crash of thunder or the drama of an earthquake, but instead with the soundless weight of inevitability, like a book falling closed after the final page, or the last drop of rain sliding down a window pane after a storm has moved on. Holding that letter in my hands, the one Matthew had written not to his children or his wife, but to me, the sister-in-law he barely spoke to at family gatherings, the woman he must have known would be standing in exactly this place at exactly this time, was one of those moments, and even before I opened the envelope, before I saw the first word written in his heavy, slanted handwriting, I felt the gravity of what was waiting inside. It was dated a week before he died, a week before Caroline took center stage in her new role as widow, mother, and financial steward of a trust she never respected, a lifestyle she never truly earned, and a family she believed she could shape through force of will and social expectation alone. He must have written it in pain, his body already betraying him, his future growing smaller by the hour, and yet the words were precise, thoughtful, and composed in a way that made me understand, possibly for the first time, just how much he had seen, how much he had feared, and how much he had tried, in his final days, to fix the damage before it was too late. He began by thanking me, a small, unexpected detail that struck me harder than it should have, not for anything I had done specifically, but for being present, for showing up, for listening when no one else would. He wrote about hospital visits where Caroline didn't stay more than 10 minutes, where she kept checking her phone and talking about estate planning, where she smiled too brightly for the nurses and never once asked about his pain. He said he had started to see her clearly during those last weeks, not as the woman he had married, but as the version of herself she had become, consumed by image, obsessed with control, incapable of vulnerability, unless it could be weaponized. He said he had no illusions that I was perfect. That made me laugh, bitter and honest, but he said he trusted me with the truth in a way he couldn't trust her anymore, not because I was smarter or stronger, but because I wasn't pretending. Because I knew what it felt like to lose, to fail, to live without pretense. And because of that, he believed I'd know what to protect and when to act. Then came the part that chilled me, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed everything I had come to suspect. He wrote that he feared Caroline would use the trust not to secure a future for Maddie and Jake, but to maintain a life she had become addicted to, that she would hide behind the language of motherhood while siphoning resources meant for their stability, their education, their freedom. He wrote that he had structured the trust in a way that gave her room to move because he knew she would resent tight control, but that he had added my name, not as a courtesy, but as a safeguard. He wrote that if I ever felt something was off, I was to act decisively, without hesitation, and without explanation. You owe her no justification, he wrote. You owe them a future. By the time I finished reading, I realized I had been holding my breath. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, the television silent, the street outside nearly still, and all I could hear was the distant hum of the fridge and the echo of Matthew's words in my head, turning over and over like pebbles in a stream. He had known it all, and he had trusted me not because he thought I was capable of heroics, but because he believed I understood what it meant to be ordinary and still try to do the right thing. I didn't tell anyone about the letter, not Caroline, not Maddie, not Jake, not even David. I put it in a drawer and locked it away, not out of fear, but because I knew its power and its burden. I had what I needed. I had the truth. And more importantly, I had already acted on it, long before the letter arrived in my hands. In the weeks that followed, Caroline did what she always did when cornered. She tried to spin, to charm, to pivot, but something had broken in her that even she couldn't fully disguise. She hosted a small dinner party to save face, and only half the chairs were filled. She posted less on social media, and when she did, the comments felt more like polite distance than admiration. She started volunteering more, and I couldn't tell whether it was damage control or genuine remorse, but either way, it didn't land the way she wanted it to. People remembered. People always remember when the cracks finally show. Maddie, to her credit, didn't turn cold. She didn't storm out or reject her mother or cause a dramatic rift. But she did begin to spend more time with me, coming over to study, to talk, to sit in quiet, and eat takeout in front of old movies without having to smile for anyone. Jake followed, slower, more cautiously, but even he began to pull back from the performance of their home life. Caroline noticed, of course, and for the first time, I think she saw the cost of everything she'd spent her life chasing. The last time I saw her face to face, she looked tired in a way that, makeup couldn't hide. She asked me if I was happy, with just the faintest edge of mockery, as if losing everything but my dignity made me the fool. And I told her calmly and without malice that I was because I was, not because I had won anything. This wasn't about winning. There were no trophies, no standing ovations, no dramatic victories. There was just the steady, exhausting process of choosing what mattered and letting go of everything that didn't. And if that made me an underachiever in her eyes, then so be it. Later that night, I went out onto my small porch with a glass of wine, not expensive, not memorable, just something to hold as I watched the sunset stretch across the street like a final curtain on a long, complicated performance. I pulled the letter from the drawer, read it one last time, and then, with a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, I struck a match and lit it on fire. The paper curled in on itself like it had always known it wouldn't last forever, and I held it until the flames kissed my fingertips, then let it go into the ashtray, where it finished turning into dust. Not because I wanted to erase what Matthew had said, not because I wanted to forget, but because I had done what he asked, and I didn't need the letter anymore. All I needed was the truth, and the strength to live with it. And maybe, just maybe, that's what it means to really protect someone, even when they don't know it, even when they never say thank you, even when no one ever will.